theologian, recently revisited New York's Union Theological Seminary. He had taught here for 20 years.
I see your favorite alcove even has your old chair in it.
Yes. No, why don't you sit there? It's
No, I'm
more
comfortable. Fine.
Yes, now then tell me a little bit about you. What are you doing?
As you know, I'm still working in the Missionary Research Library. But never mind me. What about you? And how do you feel about Union? How do you feel about being back?
Oh, when I saw this morning all these people whose faces I know, with whom I lived for so many years, I feel as somebody who comes home, not as a lost son or prodigal son, but perhaps as somebody who is still liked by those to whom he returns.
By the way, you never did tell me, how did you start out? Did you want to be a teacher or did you want to be a preacher?
No, I was interested in philosophical problems very early. I remember that when I was 8 years old and was lying in my bed before sleeping, I thought about the problem of the infinite. And this grasped me with a tremendous power. And ever since, I thought about philosophical problems. And then I saw the relationship of the philosophical and the theological problems. And in some periods of my life, the theological were stronger, in others the philosophical. But in any case, I always remained on the boundary line between philosophy and theology.
Of course, I know you were very active politically back in Germany.
Yes, if you call it politically, you see, it was not really a political party to which I belonged or with which I worked, but it was an attempt to solve the social problems and the political problems of the post-First World War Germany in terms of the theological and religious principles. And this produced a movement, and a very strong one, but not strong enough to resist the growing Nazism and growing Hitlerism. So when Hitler came, you know what happened.
You had to leave.
No, that happened in a very dramatic and nice way. The list of those professors who were first dismissed was published in the American press. After this, the Nazis didn't publish it anymore. But I was on the first list, which was still published. And immediately when Professor Niebuhr of Union Seminary and Professor Fries of Columbia heard about it, who knew my work, came to Germany and asked me to come. And I came.
And out of this trip came your 15-year stay in this country.
Now 22 years.
Oh, 22, that's right.
22 years in this country, yes, and 22 very great years in my life.
A while ago, you spoke about the change of problems over in Europe and here, the change from the psychological to the from the political to the psychological. Could you tell me about how this developed in the last 10 years?
Yes, that's a very interesting development which I experienced. When I came to this country, Europe was full of anxiety, feeling of meaninglessness, and all this exploded finally in the Hitler Revolution and in communism and in the Second World War. When I came to this country, very little of this was noticeable. You simply couldn't find much of it. I, of course, gave in my lectures, but in the first years there was very little reply to all this. The couldn't really find what I was talking about because they hadn't experienced these things. Now slowly the situation changed. In the later 30s, in the Second World War, and especially during the Cold War after the Second World War, something of that anxiety which we had in Europe before became visible also in this country. And I noticed it very much in my lectures and sermons in the colleges and universities. And whenever I spoke in the especially last 5 years, about the different forms of anxiety and so on, then there was a tremendous response in all these younger people, and in many of the older too, but especially in the younger people. So that I finally decided to give some foundation lectures in Yale University, the so-called Terry lectures, under the heading of what later became my book, The Courage to Be. This simply means I wanted to give an answer to the growing anxiety which developed also in this country. The answer was courage, but a very special kind of courage, of course, which I tried to develop there, not the courage of the soldier, but the courage of the human being, who feels all the riddles and all the meaninglessness of life, and who nevertheless is able to say yes to life.
I would think a definition of doctrine or a presentation of the Christian faith.
Yes, now that's, these two things are often used, I agree with you, but each of them is terribly difficult, and you know, I have another definition, and I will repeat it now, since you asked me that question. I believe faith, that word, should be defined as a state of being ultimately concerned. Now, this is like a stumbling block for some people. They will be shocked by it. Certainly, I know they are. But I insist on it because I believe it's perhaps the best way of understanding the reality and the seriousness of religion and of faith. Now, ultimately concerned means man has many concerns. Artistic concerns, daily life concerns, food and clothes, and concern about friends, about women, about everything, and men, marriage and children, everything. But there's one concern I believe every human being has, namely the concern about what his life as a whole does mean. And that's what I call ultimate concern. Every faith expresses itself in some ideas, in some actions, or as I would call them, in some symbols. Symbols are expressions of faith, whether it's success, or whether it's the nation, or whether it's one human being, which is your ultimate concern, or whether it's some being which is called God. In any case, they are symbols of our ultimate concern. They express it. And now I come to the task of theology. And that's my whole life's work of which I am speaking now. Namely, theology has to show what these symbols mean, what kind of faith is behind them. Not only behind the Christian symbols, but also symbols like nation or success or progress or science. They all can become symbols of an ultimate concern.
The function of the theologian, then, is to investigate into the symbols.
Yes, certainly. That's what I always have said and defended. Now, the question is how to do it and what to do with these symbols. You can say they all are something which must be removed. And there are important theologians today who want to remove all symbols. I don't believe they are right. There is no religion without symbols. There is no any faith without a symbolic expression. So we must not remove them. On the other hand, we cannot take them simply literally and speak of them as if it were a story which happens here in our room. But it's something which expresses and points to something else, namely to our ultimate concern. Now this leads me, has led me always, or for a long time, to the following method. I ask first the human questions. For instance, as we did shortly before, the question of anxiety or the question of guilt, the question of doubt, of meaninglessness, all these human questions. And then I try to show how these human questions are answered by the religious symbols. For instance, as Christian theologian, I would say by the Christian symbols, God, the Christ, and the others. Now this I call the method of correlation. Here the human questions, here the religious symbols. And to understand these symbols, you must relate them to the human questions. Otherwise they are ununderstandable. I often say to ministers and theologians, don't throw stones at the heads of people, but try to make understandable to them what you say. If you throw your dogmas and doctrines like stones at them, they will turn away. They cannot take them. But if you make understandable what these symbols mean, then they will see suddenly, this is not all nonsense, that's not all unbelievable tradition, but that's something which concerns them directly. Now that's what I mean with the method of correlation. Oh, it's time. Do you hear the bell ringing? Yes, you have to run down to the lecture room. Will you come with me? As in good old times?
The National Broadcasting Company has presented a conversation with Dr. Paul Tillich, prominent Protestant theologian, now university professor at Harvard. With Dr. Tillich was Werner Rode.